This morning, something landed on my desk that signaled the end of an era in North American economic history. It was not a press release from Washington, nor an official statement from Ottawa. It was a digital log from the St. Lawrence Seaway Management Corporation. As of 03 Eastern Time, the freighter Atlantic Huron, laden with essential industrial components, did not receive its clearance to enter the Eisenhower Lock. It was redirected to a holding anchorage in Lake Ontario. Beside it, 3 other vessels were ordered to maintain a 5-mile standoff. This is not a routine maintenance delay. This is a deliberate, calculated calibration of the North American supply chain, and it marks the moment when Canada transitioned from a passive trade partner to an active sovereign player in its own industrial destiny. The context here is critical, and it moves well beyond the surface-level reports of a standard tariff dispute. For decades, the Canada-US trade relationship functioned under a tacit agreement. The United States provided the market, and Canada provided the raw materials and the logistical corridors. It was a relationship built on the assumption of infinite, seamless access. That assumption died this week, when the Trump administration unveiled its latest broad-spectrum tariffs on Canadian lumber, dairy, and more importantly, specialized auto components. The White House anticipated a reflexive, defensive response. They expected the typical diplomatic hand-wringing and perhaps some retaliatory posturing directed at energy exports. What they did not anticipate was Mark Carney, the architect of Canada's current economic war room. Carney understands that modern sovereignty is not defined by borders on a map, but by the control of flow. The strategic logic behind the current hold-up is a masterclass in asymmetrical leverage. Carney is not playing the tariff game, he is playing the physics of freight. By reallocating inspection resources at key choke points, the Ambassador Bridge, the rail yards of Sault-Ste. Marie, and the Seaway locks, Canada has effectively weaponized the bureaucracy of trade. Consider the sequencing. First, the declaration of new, rigorous operational continuity protocols for all southbound cargo. This is a legal shield. It allows the Canadian Border Services Agency to tie up cross-border flow under the guise of safety and security. Because the infrastructure at these locations is singular and non-redundant, the effect is immediate. A single 3-hour delay in a customs check at the Ambassador Bridge creates a cascading backlog that ripples through the I-75 corridor into the heart of the American Midwest. The depth of this dependency is staggering. Nearly 25% of all transborder commerce transits through the Detroit-Windsor crossing. When you combine this with the fact that 40% of the fertilizer required for the upcoming American planting season moves exclusively on Canadian rail, the vulnerability of the American heartland becomes absolute. This is the hidden architecture that the casual observer ignores. The American industrial base is not just dependent on Canadian goods, it is dependent on the velocity of Canadian logistics. When Carney slows that velocity, he isn't just raising costs, he is degrading the capability of the American manufacturing machine to produce. By prioritizing domestic movement and enforcing strict, bottleneck-heavy inspections on outbound loads, Canada is forcing the United States to experience the reality of its own trade protectionism. The official narrative in Washington remains one of bluster, with spokespeople insisting that interagency working groups will resolve the matter. But this is where the surface-level interpretation fails. No working group can bypass the physical limit of the Welland Canal's lock cycles. No executive order can force a vessel through a passage if the harbour master has not cleared it for a safety inspection. The authority stack Carney possesses, direct coordination between the Seaway, Transport Canada, and the Border Services Agency, creates a unified, centralised command that the fragmented American administrative state cannot match. The American system is designed for deregulation and high-volume flow. It lacks the institutional mechanism to manage a sudden, state-directed constriction of the pipe. This situation is not about the specific goods being taxed. It is about proving that the 49th parallel is not merely an administrative convenience but a sovereign lever. The market has already sensed the shift. When fertilizer logistics futures began to decouple from the actual cost of nitrogen, it was a clear signal that the financial world realized the supply chain is no longer a guaranteed utility. We are seeing a 300% increase in cross-border trucking premiums, And for the first time in a generation, the insurance underwriters are pulling back. When you cannot secure a policy for a load of automotive components crossing the border, the load does not move. When the load does not move, the assembly lines go dark. This is the cold reality of the current shift. We are observing the decoupling of two deeply integrated economies in real time, managed not by the slow grinding of judicial review, but by the precise surgical application of logistical friction. The United States is discovering, perhaps too late, that the infrastructure they relied upon to sustain their domestic production is governed by a neighbour who is no longer willing to accommodate their strategic pressure. The American economy is built on a just-in-time foundation, and the valve controlling that flow is now firmly in the hands of a government that has learned how to operate it as a defensive weapon. But the most consequential question remains: if this is merely the opening move in a wider decoupling, what does the total cessation of this logistical lifeline mean for the long-term viability of the North American Manufacturing Union? If the previous assessment of the border's fragility felt like a warning, understand this. The architecture behind it is not a chaotic reaction. It is a highly engineered, multi-layered maneuver designed to force a total repricing of North American trade. We are not looking at a mere dispute over duty rates or tariff schedules. We are looking at the fundamental restructuring of how Canadian assets interface with the American industrial machine. Mark Carney's economic war room, a term now appearing in internal memos at every major logistics hub from Montreal to Vancouver, is operating under a doctrine of asymmetric synchronization. To understand how this functions, we have to look at the three specific pillars of the current policy shift that have effectively turned Canadian logistics into a sovereign strategic asset. First, the implementation of the Strategic Interoperability Protocol. This is the mechanism that has quietly superseded standard customs processing. Under these new directives, the Canada Border Services Agency, CBSA, has been empowered to synchronise safety inspections with domestic priority lanes. By categorising southbound freight as low-priority transit and reserving the high-speed automated inspection lanes for northbound domestic essentials, specifically energy, food, and critical medical supplies, the government has effectively created a two-tier border. It's not a closed border, it is a prioritised one. And since the physical capacity of crossings like the Ambassador Bridge or the Blue Water Bridge is finite, every hour a truck carrying American-bound auto parts spends in a secondary inspection queue is an hour of lost productivity for a factory in Ohio or Tennessee. This is not about stopping trade, it is about controlling the flow rate to ensure that domestic Canadian needs are serviced before a single ton of American-bound freight is processed. Second, the structural rerouting of rail and inland maritime traffic via the Seaway Sovereign Corridor Initiative. This was the move that caught the White House off guard. By officially designating the St. Lawrence Seaway and the major Canadian national and CPKC rail nodes as national interest infrastructure, the Prime Minister has effectively removed them from the jurisdiction of standard private sector scheduling. The government now mandates flow balancing on these assets. If a bottleneck emerges at a transload facility in Chicago, Canadian authorities now possess the administrative reach to prioritise the movement of Canadian origin grain and potash over the general freight throughput of American carriers. We are seeing a 12% increase in grain movement this quarter, not because demand increased, but because the government forced the rails to prioritise export capacity at the expense of American-bound industrial goods. Third, the financial anchoring of these decisions through the Supply Chain Continuity Fund. This is where Carney's background as a central banker becomes the decisive factor. This fund serves as a state-backed insurance mechanism for Canadian logistics providers. When American insurers began pulling coverage for cross-border transit due to the increased risk of detention, the Canadian government stepped in, providing sovereign guarantees for temperature-sensitive cargo and high-value industrial shipments. This essentially subsidises the wait time that is bankrupting smaller American logistics firms. By keeping their own operators solvent while American counterparts struggle under the mounting costs of idling, Canada is systematically capturing market share in the essential logistics sector. They are not just slowing the border, They are building the infrastructure to survive the friction while their competitors wither. The strategic message here is clear. The era of frictionless trade is being replaced by an era of managed transit. The White House assumes this is a temporary annoyance that can be negotiated away with the right political concessions. But if you look at the recent investment in digital port tracking technology and the new labour stability agreements currently being ratified in the marine sector, it is evident that these are not temporary measures. They are long-term institutional adjustments. Canada is building a system that treats its transportation network as a defensive perimeter. The most dangerous assumption in Washington remains that this is a zero-sum game of tariffs. But that misses the point. By choosing to target the coordination points, those specific rail-to-truck transfer sites, and the precise timing of lock cycles, Carney has exploited the fact that the North American supply chain is not a collection of independent markets, but a single, tightly coupled machine. A machine that, for the first time in history, is being managed from a desk in Ottawa with the express intent of ensuring that Canadian industry survives the coming protectionist winter. Regardless of the cost to the American heartland, we are watching the transition from a trade relationship based on mutual trust to one defined by absolute, measurable control. As the spring planting season intensifies and the pressure on the Great Lakes shipping lanes reaches its peak in the coming weeks, the question will no longer be about what the tariffs cost. It will be about who can keep their machines running when the flow of goods is no longer a given. But behind these technical maneuvers, a deeper, more unsettling question remains. What happens when the logic of national interest finally forces a total decoupling of the two most integrated economies on Earth? The logistical paralysis we have mapped over the last two parts is not an isolated crisis. It is the definitive signal of a permanent transition in North American power dynamics. We have moved from a model of integrated, frictionless commerce to a reality of sovereign friction, where the 49th parallel has been hardened not by physical walls, but by the strategic control of transit flows, thus zooming out. The broader implications are existential. For decades, the Canada-US relationship operated under the assumption that geographical proximity and deep trade integration made economic conflict impossible. That era is over. The current strategy, orchestrated by the Prime Minister's office under Mark Carney, represents a fundamental shift toward economic deterrence. Canada is no longer content to act as the raw material wing of the American manufacturing machine. It is asserting its own industrial autonomy. By weaponizing the choke points of the Great Lakes and the rail corridors, Ottawa has signaled that Canada's economic interests, specifically in energy, critical minerals and agriculture, will be protected even if that protection imposes direct, acute costs on the American heartland. YouTube This is a profound departure from the pre-2025 norm. In the old world, trade disputes were managed through diplomatic committees and legalistic arbitration under the USMCA. Today, those forums are irrelevant in the face of what is essentially a sovereign logistical blockade. The United States, accustomed to using economic pressure to dictate terms, now finds itself facing a partner that has identified the structural vulnerabilities of the American supply chain and is willing to exploit them to force a rebalancing of the trade relationship. The consequences for global alliances are equally severe. We are witnessing the birth of a more assertive middle power approach, where Canada seeks to diversify its trade dependencies away from the United States, while simultaneously leveraging its status as a critical energy and resource supplier to other global actors. While Washington remains mired in domestic litigation over tariff refunds and internal gridlock, Canada is quietly pivoting its energy and trade infrastructure to face both Europe and the Pacific. This is not just a trade war, it is a realignment. The next critical juncture arrives in just a few weeks. The 2026 USMCA review process is looming, and it is no longer a simple bureaucratic exercise. It is now a high-stakes standoff where the United States must decide whether it intends to continue its current tariff-led pressure, or whether it will finally acknowledge that the continental supply chain is no longer under its unilateral control. The silence from Washington to date suggests a fundamental misunderstanding of the gravity of the situation. As the spring planting window closes and the logistical bottlenecks harden into permanent operational constraints, the window for a negotiated return to normalcy is slamming shut. We are at the threshold of a new, more fragmented economic geography, and the primary lesson for every observer is simple. When you depend on a neighbour for your survival, you no longer have the luxury of treating them as a subordinate.